Alright, in this video we're going to review the reproductive system and how organisms develop. And we're just going to quickly breeze through some of these. For bacteria, remember bacteria reproduce through a process called binary fission. And binary fission, which is just simply almost like mitosis, except for a lot simpler because bacteria don't have all the organelles. And so their DNA simply replicates and the cell divides, and that can happen very rapidly. But bacteria do have several ways of creating variation in their reproduction. A couple of these are transformation, and transformation is just simply receiving DNA from an outside source. Usually this is done artificially, but it can be done naturally as well. Then there is transduction, and this happens because bacteria comes in contact with a virus, and these viruses are called bacteriophages, and they bring a new set of DNA to the bacteria, usually in order to reproduce the virus. And then lastly is conjugation, and this is the idea of basically bacterial sex. And so this is where they exchange plasmids, where you'll have one bacteria that has the F factor and another bacteria that does not, and the one that has an F factor releases this called a sex pilus, and this sex pilus will basically transfer or makes copies of these plasmids, and the plasmid is then transferred across the new bacteria, and so they're therefore swapping bacteria or swapping DNA. This is as close to sexual reproduction as bacteria get. Because sexual reproduction, remember, is the production of gametes, and this isn't the production of gametes, so there's a definite line there. We talked about protists as well, and protists are just single-celled organisms that are eukaryotes, and most protists reproduce asexually. Some of them reproduce sexually, and remember the difference is with sexual reproduction you have haploid gametes, and male and female, and they combine to make the zygote, and the zygote is 2N, whereas those are N. All right, that's protists. Protists mostly asexual, but some sexual reproduction. With fungi, you have fungi living the majority of their life cycle in the haploid state. So, majority they live in the haploid state, and these exist as spores. Well, these spores can combine, and so you have one spore here, another spore here, and they kind of combine, and that's called plasmogamy. It's basically where the plasma is joining together. And then you have karyogamy. Kary means nucleus, so this is where you have the nucleus joined together. And so for a time you have a 2N cell. So this is similar to sexual reproduction. You have a male, female here. Well, this cell will then undergo meiosis, because remember, meiosis is how gametes are produced. Meiosis produces 4 haploid cells, and in this case these cells are brand new spores that go on and reproduce again. With plants, a little more complicated. You have what's called the alternation of generations. And so plants will alternate between the sporophyte generation, which is the 2N, and the gametophyte generation, which is the 1N. And essentially what's going on here is the sporophyte generation is what we normally think of when we think of a plant. This is like the, this is the tree in the quad, and it produces spores, male and female. Well, we don't see these spores; they're shrouded in other cells. And uh, the male sex cell is the pollen, and the female sex cell is the egg, and it's buried in a flower, or in pine cones, there's a male and female cone. In other more primitive plants, there's just a male part and a female part of the plant. Ferns have one gametophyte that have the male and female sections, and mosses even have a male and female different types of plants, but you get the idea. You have a 2N gametophyte, and in order to get to the or 2N sporophyte, in order to get to the gametophyte stage, it has to go through meiosis. So these cells have to go through meiosis. And this is when you have the male pollen, the female egg, and they have to combine. Well, when they combine, what is that process called? It's called fertilization. And that's where you get the 2N, usually starting as a seed and then getting bigger. All right. Now for male animals. It's pretty simple with male animals. Males go through a process called spermatogenesis. Spermatosperm genesis creates. So this is the process of making sperm. And so you have a 2N cell called a spermatogonia. And from that 2N cell, remember meiosis happens, it's two divisions. And then you have the 1N sperm cells. Now, this process creates 4 haploid cells. Each one of them is different from the other one. For males, the hormone patterns in males are not cyclic, meaning that they're not released in a cyclic pattern like female hormones are just released when they're needed. Male have primary and secondary sexual characteristics. The primary characteristics for males is just simply the ability to make sperm. And the secondary sexual characteristics, these are things like facial hair, muscle mass, deep voice. These are the things that make males males. All right, and this has to do with a hormone that's being produced uh, in the womb and at the start of puberty called GnRH, and this usually continues until death. So this is not a cyclic thing. Whereas with females, it's a little different. So first of all, the production of eggs is called oogenesis. So you still have the 2N cell, the oogonium or the oogonium. And here you have one cell that's receiving most of the mass. So there's little cells called a polar body. All right. Well, another division happens, and the same thing occurs. You have more polar bodies being created. And these polar bodies can be reabsorbed back into the system. They're not necessary. And so you have one egg that's being made, and it's getting all the cytoplasm. Why? Because the egg carries all of the organelles for the early organism's development, whereas the sperm simply only carries DNA and some proteins with it, and some a few mitochondria. And so for females, the hormone pattern is cyclic. In most animals, this pattern is called estrous cycles, whereas in humans, this is called the menstrual cycle, and this is 28 days long, and it's broken up into different uh, categories here. So first you have what's called the menstrual flow phase. In the menstrual flow phase, this is where the old endometrium, this is the lining of the uterus, is getting ready to have a shed because pregnancy did not occur. In days 5 through 13, this is called the proliferative phase, and proliferate means to spread out. So proliferative phase, this is where estrogen, the production of estrogen, causes a new endometrium to be built back up. And again, the endometrium is this lining for the uterus, and it acts as like a fetal cushion, a receiving bed for the fertilized egg if that was to occur. Then you have the secretory phase, and this is where progesterone, so let me write these down here, estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone causes the release of well, I'm ahead of myself here. Day 14 is ovulation, and this is the release of the egg. 14 through 25 is the secretory phase, and this is where progesterone causes the new endometrium to release a sugary substance, and this sugar will actually feed the developing fetus if that occurs. And then days 25 through 28 are called the endometrial breakdown phase. And this is if pregnancy has not occurred, and then the endometrium begins to be broken down, and then you go back through the entire cycle again. Now, there's an ovarian cycle as well, and it is going on the same time as the menstrual cycle, and occurs in tandem with that. You know, the things are happening side by side. A couple steps here. GnRH is released by the hypothalamus, and this travels to the anterior pituitary gland. And then and what this GnRH does is this is signaling because the hypothalamus is kind of like the control center for all of your hormone functions, and the anterior pituitary or the posterior pituitary, either one of them, kind of act as a messenger to the whole body via the hypothalamus. And so from the anterior pituitary gland is going to come follicle stimulating hormone. Now, what is follicle stimulating hormone? It travels to the ovaries to stimulate the follicles to begin to mature. And so then you have the follicular phase, and this is days 1 through 13. And in the follicular phase, the follicle and the egg are maturing and releasing estrogen as they mature. And with that release of estrogen causes the new buildup of the endometrium. So these things are happening in tandem again. And then you have ovulation. And then the second part is called the luteal phase. And the corpus luteum, which is now empty follicle that just released the egg, produces progesterone and estrogen as it's degrading. And so when this corpus luteum is gone, it causes the hypothalamus to detect no more progesterone production, and that causes that to then trigger the release of GnRH and starts the next cycle. And so what happens when fertilization occurs, the developing fetus actually mimics the corpus luteum, and it mimics so that your body doesn't restart the cycle, and until HGH, human growth hormone, is starting to be produced to prevent the next cycle. And so one more term here, menopause, is just when no more GnRH is being released. So there's no more menstrual cycles, no more possible pregnancies. And this happens usually between 40 and 50 years old. Now, one more quick thing. Let's talk about the developing fetus. Here, fertilization again. Sperm and egg combine, create a new organism. And that new organism, so here's the new fertilized egg. That new organism will begin to divide rapidly, like a basketball or an orange, and won't actually grow. We'll kind of skip the G1 phase, and it's just simply dividing rapidly in order to get lots of cells until you have this ball of cells called a morula. And again, the morula is just this giant ball of cells, so think baseball. Well, that ball of cells will then hollow out and become a blastula. So think tennis ball here, hollowed out ball. And this blastula has different regions to it. It now has a top and a bottom. And the top is called the animal pole, and the bottom is called the vegetal pole, and the hollow space in the middle is called the blastule. Blastule, animal pole, and vegetal pole. Well, the blastula continues to develop. This is all happening within the first month. The blastula is happening within the first few days, but then this next phase is called gastrulation, and so which produces the gastrula. And so I like to think of this as if you have a balloon in your hand and you put one of your fingers and poke through the middle. Basically what's happening is a hole is being formed through the body in order to make your digestive tube. And so you have this hollow space, which is called the archenteron, and this is going to become this digestive tract. And there's two tubes that are being made, all right? And you have the deuterostome, which deutero means second stome opening, so this is your second opening. So this one's working anus to mouth, and protostome, first opening, is working the opposite way. And so these two openings meet in the middle, and you have the production of your digestive tube. And you also have with this the production of 3 tissue layers. So this innermost layer here is going to be called the endoderm. And this is where your digestive organs and that sort of thing come from. Then you have a middle layer, which is where your muscles and bones, kidneys come from. This is called the mesoderm. And then lastly, the outer layer is called the ectoderm. And this is skin and nervous system that are produced from this.